Aviation is a modern marvel that connects our world, much like music transcends boundaries to touch our hearts. As musicians crisscross the globe, their journeys are often set against the backdrop of vast skies with the turn of a prop or the hum of a jet engine. Yet within the realm of possibilities, there exists a somber reality. Plane accidents that have forever altered the course of music history. While aviation is generally a safe and efficient means of travel, there are moments, like with any travel, when the harmony of flight is disrupted. Today we're going to explore some of these stories. Stories that bring us closer to the lives of musicians that we've adored. Stories that remind us of the fragility of existence. The stories that pay homage to the dedication and sacrifices made in pursuit of artistic excellence. We will go into further detail with some select stories, and we'll remember the artists who once soared among the clouds, leaving behind a legacy of melodies that continue to resonate to this day. These are the stories that echo not only within the world of aviation, but also the hearts of music enthusiasts worldwide. So fasten your mental seatbelts and prepare for a journey into the skies as we explore the history of some musicians who tragically met their destiny amidst the clouds. Welcome to Destination Aviation. Well, welcome back, aviation enthusiasts, to the podcast. It's been some time since we talked. I have made my way around certain areas of the United States and Canada for vacation. Got actually to stop at some airports. I know we mentioned in the last podcast about Marquette Sawyer, which I did stop there. I actually got some ideas for some future podcasts, but they have some pretty cool displays. I'll add some photos of those trips onto the Instagram, but they have the B-52 Stratosphere parked at Marquette, so some of the aircraft that they have used in the past at that military base before it was decommissioned in the 90s. Now it's serving as a commercial airport for the Upper Peninsula. I also stopped by, there's an individual that's building an aircraft hangar in Manistee, Michigan, that currently has buildings in Rice Lake, Wisconsin, so I stopped by that airport. I took a look around there, went up to the Duluth airport. They have some interesting stuff, the home of Cirrus Manufacturing, so the Cirrus plant is there. Always an interesting spot to me to do manufacturing, but I'm sure they have a sweetheart deal from the airport to do that in Duluth. Nonetheless, very nice airport to go around and take a look at. Duluth itself is an interesting city to get through. My intention was to go north to International Falls, which I did end up getting through. It's just the road system's all shut down. So at some point it'll probably be easy to get through Duluth, but you find yourself driving more around Duluth than you probably wanted to. But I made my way northbound, which has some of the restricted, prohibited areas of flight for the U.S. international border. Prohibitive area P204, if you're looking at your sectional, which restricts flight over the Voyager National Park area on the border of Canada, was signed in to law from President Jimmy Carter. But it does add, the national park itself I had not been to before. I definitely recommend bringing a canoe. There are some hiking trails. I forget the ratio. It's like a quarter of the park is accessible via foot, the rest of it via kayak. And you can do camping. You can take your kayak from a launch point and camp. I think they have something like over 250 designated camping zones within the area. So it's a unique national park, but definitely recommend it. And then, like I said, made my way back, stopped at some airports, looked around, got some ideas for future podcasts, but definitely enjoyed my time. While I was out over the Labor Day weekend, of course, I heard of Jimmy Buffett passing away, almost in the way of his endless summer ending in Labor Day. So kind of poetic in that sense. Of course, whether we are expecting it or not expecting it, it's always tough to lose someone that touched our lives in some ways. And music artists often do that. Whether you like their music or don't like their music, there resonates a connection with people. I lived in Florida for a while. I worked down there. I worked in aviation in Florida for several years. and was a Jimmy Buffett fan. I'd say still a Jimmy Buffett fan. I haven't listened as much to his music over the last probably 15 years as I had done before. Found myself listening to some of his songs after he passed. I actually had Jimmy Buffett tickets in the early 2000s to a show in Tampa, but unfortunately I was not able to make it. So I ended up giving those tickets away, and now, as most things in life, you look in the rearview mirror and you think I should have done it, but did not. So, however, with the passing of Jimmy Buffett, there is an interesting story if you've gone to any of his Margaritavilles. Obviously, we know Jimmy Buffett was a big aviator, had a lot of time in the sky, talk to people that, if you're in this industry or even if you're not, you usually hear people that met up with him or flew for him or, met him at a FBO or fixed base operator or whatever it might have been. Usually good stories. So there is a story specifically that happened to him in Jamaica that I think we'll talk about at the end of the podcast here, which is interesting. Knowing his connection to aviation, then thinking about musicians, I thought, well, there's so much to talk about with musicians that have altered the course of music career with aviation. And I figured maybe we could touch on a few different stories for this podcast and go into some of the details before we wrap up here. Without further ado, I will get into the podcast details themselves. Thanks for being here. If this is your first episode, thank you for coming back. We are going to put together some podcast stickers. Maybe I'll put a link into the website or something. If anybody wants a sticker, you can reach out to me. But still working on the design, putting it together, working with some artists on that. Also, get the word out about what this show is and what we do here. Appreciate the response that I've had so far. So, all right, I said without further ado, let's get into some details. Obviously, I think where we start this conversation is what resonates with many people, but surprisingly, some not at all. The song from Don McLean, American Pie, in 1971, is about the tragic incident that happened in 1959, where Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, the Big Bopper, J.P. Richardson passed away in a plane accident. I was on a phone call with the Federal Aviation Administration, and we got a moment of brevity. We were talking about that song. They brought it up, and, oh yeah, we were listening to American Pie, and my kids don't like that style of music, right? That song came out in 1971, and this conversation happened more recently within the last 6 months. They don't like that song. They like to listen to, rap music, et cetera, et cetera. But she said, there's that, there's my job is boring, they say stuff like that. And I go, oh, well, there you go. There's your connection. You can talk about American Pie and how you make aviation safer now. And so you don't have to worry about your musical artist dying today, or a much lesser chance of your musical artist dying today. And, there was a laugh, and then they kind of stared at me, and I was like, I don't think that they understand the meaning of the song. So Don McLean wrote American Pie about the day the music died because all three of those artists perished in an accident in 1959 when they were traveling between gigs. I will find there's some photos online, and I'll try to put one onto the Instagram account of what that picture is, or if you look up yourself, you can see them. It was definitely a case of get it there-itis, and we'll talk a little bit about the incident themselves. But some people don't really understand sometimes where history has driven us. The day the music died in 1959, the tragic and significant event in history of music and aviation. On February 3rd, 1959, three pioneering rock and roll musicians, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson, lost their lives in the plane accident near Clear Lake, Iowa. The ill-fated journey began in the aftermath of a tour known as the Winter Dance Party. Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper, with other musicians, had been traveling across the Midwest during a harsh winter of 1959. Don't probably have to explain to too many people winter in Iowa in 1959 or today. It's sometimes not conducive for the best type of flying weather. So they were performing various venues. The tour was plagued with problems, including the lack of reliable transportation and heating on the tour bus. And you remember most of these guys are still young and they're in the beginning of their careers. On the night of February 2nd, 1959, the tour stopped at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa. This is for their scheduled performance that they were going to have there. The conditions were freezing, and the musicians were tired and frustrated at the hardships of the tour. So the decision was made to fly. Buddy Holly, who was growing increasingly frustrated with the tour buses, he decided to charter a small plane to fly to their next destination, which was in Moorhead, Minnesota. He secured the aircraft, a Beechcraft Bonanza, from Dyer Flying Service, despite a few reservations. The original plane was for Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper to board the plane. However, Waylon Jennings, a member of Buddy Holly's band, voluntarily gave up his seat to J.P. Richardson, who was suffering from the flu, and the pilot, Roger Peterson, were also on board. One of the things that was interesting, it was actually highlighted in an episode of The X-Files, an earlier on episode of The X-Files, was a coin toss, and the fact that Valens won his seat in a coin toss. He won this from Tommy Alsop, who was a guitarist who, up to his death in 2017 at the age of 85, was best known for losing coin toss that kept him off the aircraft. But knowing that your whole life, everything you've done up to that point, comes down to a simple toss of a coin, 50-50 chance to live or die. Supposedly after hearing that Waylon Jennings had voluntarily gave up his seat, Buddy Holly told Jennings, I hope your old bus freezes up, in an eerie response that allegedly haunted Jennings until his death in 2002, because Jennings said back, well, I hope your plane crashes. In a joking manner, obviously, but nevertheless was said. The aircraft was a Beechcraft Model 35 that took off from Mason City Municipal Airport, had a registration of November 3794 November. After the performance at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa, all the musicians were driven to the nearby Mason City Municipal Airport. They arrived at 12:40 a.m. They were met by their assigned pilot, Roger Peterson, and they boarded the charter airplane. At 12:55 a.m., the aircraft took off from the airfield. During the previous 8 hours, Roger Peterson had telephoned the air traffic communication services 3 times for weather forecasted in his planned route. He informed that the weather was VFR with ceilings of 4,200 feet and visibility of 10 miles. ATCS did not inform Peterson of a flash advisory of 100-mile wide band of snow moving into the area at 25 knots. Moderate to heavy icing conditions were present, along with winds of 30 to 50 knots. While taxiing to the runway, the pilot once again radioed ATCS for weather. It was now reported with ceilings of 3,000 feet, sky obscured with a visibility of 6 miles and light snow. Winds were gusting from 20 to 30 knots. After a normal takeoff, the airplane climbed to approximately 800 feet, made a 180-degree turn. It passed the airport heading northwest. The charter service owner, Hubert Dyer, watched the airplane depart from the airport's tower. He was able to see the airplane's navigation lights until it was about 5 miles away. Then it slowly descended out of sight. When Peterson activated his flight plan by radio after taking off, as expected, Dyer asked ATCS to try and contact him. No contact was established. The airplane and its passengers never arrived at its destinations. After sunrise, Dyer began an air search for the missing airplane. At 9:35 a.m., he located the crashed airplane in a farm field approximately 5 miles northwest of the airport. The airplane was destroyed and all 4 occupants were dead. There were 4 inches of snow on the ground. The pilot, Roger Peterson, was 21 years old, and he had been issued a commercial pilot certificate. So 21 years old, commercial pilot. Obviously, to some of the other crashes we've had at 21 years old with a commercial pilot, his experience was not as great as some of the other pilots that had had incidents. He had flown 711 flight hours. He had a single-engine land rating and was a certified flight instructor. So really someone that we would see today that just starting their career. Roger Peterson worked for Dyer for 1 year before the accident had happened. Peterson had acquired 52 hours of instrument flight training and had passed the written test for the rating, but had failed an instrument flight check the previous year. Peterson had 128 hours in the Beechcraft Bonanza. The Beechcraft Bonanza, in this case November 3794 November, was well equipped for instrument flight. The attitude indicator was a Sperry gyroscope. However, this aircraft displayed pitched attitude in a very different way than Peterson was used to. At the time, the predecessor to the Federal Aviation Administration, the Civil Aeronautics Board, investigated the accident. There was no indication of engine malfunction or structural failure of the aircraft. Investigators concluded that as Peterson flew away from the airport, he entered an area of total darkness, unable to see anything which would give him a visual cue of the airplane's flight attitude. The unfamiliar attitude indicator may have confused him. He quickly became spatially disoriented and lost control of the Bonanza. Similar to what they say had happened to John F. Kennedy Jr. When he was flying back to the mainland. The Beechcraft Bonanza impacted the ground at a 90-degree right bank, with a nose-down pitched angle on a heading of 315. The right wing broke off and parts of the airplane were scattered as far as 540 feet. The passengers were thrown from the wreckage. The airspeed indicator needle was stuck between 165 to 170 knots. and the rate of climb indicator was stuck showing 3,000 feet per minute. The tachometer was stuck at 2,200 RPMs. Over 17,000 of the VTail bonanzas were made. The first airport that I worked at, I know that people around frequently refer to them as doctor killers. This happened because of a spat of high-profile crashes, many of which were doctors. Obviously, right, aviation, even to this day, is still expensive. Most rental rates around where I am, you're looking around close to $200 per hour. So this type of flying, you get someone who's, advanced in their career, whatever field they're in. They're flying for recreation mostly. It's not their day job, and you end up with multiple accidents. But in this case, seems like spatial disorientation and not a great weather report coming in, plus the amount of time in the aircraft, the total amount of flying time, and also I would assume some of get it there-itis, right? You have very high-profile musicians on your aircraft. You probably want to get them to where they're going, considering the rough ride that they've been having in the conversations that have been going on about the bus ride, not being able to get to their locations, bus breaking down. I'm sure there was a lot of pressure to make sure that this charter flight happened in completion. Unfortunately, what happened was we lost 3 musical artists, the pilot, and just an overall horrible event, which led us to the song American Pie. Yeah, last night I actually got an alert there was an accident outside of Chicago O'Hare involving a King Air that crashed. From what I was able to see, it was leaving O'Hare and going to Waterloo, but there was also some other reports about it trying to land at O'Hare and then make another pass and then crashed. It actually crashed in a town called Elk Grove, Illinois. Nobody was hurt, which is great. The aircraft looked pretty destroyed. It was in some trees. No fire, so assuming maybe fuel starvation, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. However, as we transition away from, the day the music died, this tragedy was immortalized, as we said in the song American Pie from 1971, so roughly a decade later. In summary, the crash on February 3rd, 1959 took the lives of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper, plus pilot Roger Peterson. It left people like Waylon Jennings with haunting thoughts of what was said in a casual conversation versus what happened in reality, and to the coin toss. Your whole life coming down to one flip of a coin. As we move into the next story, I want to talk about the 1970s and moving into conversation about Lynyrd Skynyrd. I actually had a rabbit named Lynyrd Skynyrd. That was in Florida. Same time I was probably listening to Jimmy Buffett. But as many of us know or have heard, Sweet Home Alabama, many of the hits from Lynyrd Skynyrd, they met an unfortunate destiny as well in the skies. So we'll talk a little bit about that incident now. So the band Lynyrd Skynyrd, American rock band, it was formed in Jacksonville, Florida. Originally, the name of the band was Miss Backyard in 1964. Lynyrd Skynyrd, I believe, was the name of their high school gym teacher. I don't think any of the band members actually liked the gym teacher, but I think that's why it became the name of their band. I think he was telling them not to pursue music, or the usual probably story there. Of course, in the short time before some of the band members lost their life, they had many hits, including Freebird and Sweet Home Alabama. The band had released 5 studio albums before the accident and 1 live album. However, the band's career was halted abruptly on October 20th, 1977, when their chartered airplane crashed. This killed Van Zant, Steve Gaines, and backup singer Casey Gaines, seriously injuring the rest of the band. So they were flying on a Convair CV-240. The registration of the aircraft was November 55 Victor Mike. I actually worked at an airport, maybe something to talk about down the road, where Convair was flying cargo. This would have been actually up recently in the last 5 or 6 years, where the aircraft left Laredo, Texas, and crashed just outside Toledo, Ohio. But I remember, picture like in 2019 seeing Convair fly in the sky. It almost had the same consistency as a blimp. I remember coming out and seeing it, and it just almost looked stationary in the air. That's how slow it was flying. Anyways, back to this story. On October 20th, 1977, the Convair CV-240 was chartering the band Lynyrd Skynyrd. This was 2 days after they released their album Street Survivors. Lynyrd Skynyrd had performed in Greenville, South Carolina. The following day, they boarded the Convair, which was en route to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they were to perform at Louisiana State University. However, tragically, the plane ran out of fuel at the end of its flight. Upon realizing the plane had insufficient fuel, the pilots attempted to navigate to Macomb Airport, about 10 miles northeast of the eventual crash site in Emmet County, Mississippi, but soon realized that the plane would not make it. As a last resort, they attempted an emergency landing in an open field about 300 yards from where the plane eventually went down. Despite their efforts, at approximately 6:52 p.m., the plane skimmed around 100 yards along the top of a tree line before smashing into a large tree and splitting into pieces in Gilbergs, Mississippi. If you do find yourself in Gilbergs, Mississippi, it's a small area. I think there is signage, but I'll also say I think it's easily missed. There is a memorial there if you want to go see this crash site. If you don't want to go see it in person, you can get on YouTube. There's a few videos on there of people that have visited this site. Early in the flight, witnesses recall the lead vocalist, Ronnie Van Zant, was lying on the floor with a pillow, had been up most of the previous night, and being in need of sleep. Several other passengers passed the time by playing cards. At some point, passengers became aware that something was wrong, and drummer Artemis Pyle recalls entering the flight deck and being told by the terrified captain, Walter McCreary, to go back and strap himself in. With the gravity of the situation clear, the passengers sat in silence, some praying. Guitarist Gary Rosington recalled hearing what sounded like hundreds of baseball bats hitting the plane's fuselage as it began striking trees. The sound got louder and louder. Rosington was knocked unconscious, and he awoke sometime later on the ground with the plane's door on top of him. Keyboard player Billy Powell's nose was nearly torn off in the crash. He suffered severe facial lacerations and deep lacerations into his right leg. Decades later, he gave the account of the flight's final moments on VH1 Behind the Music. Van Zant was not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown violently from his seat, and died immediately when his head hit a tree as the plane broke apart. Powell suffered broken ribs but managed to leave the crash and notify a nearby resident. Van Zant, guitarist, vocalist Steve Gaines, backing vocalist Casey Gaines, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, Captain McCreary, and First Officer William Gray all died in the crash. Most of the survivors had been seated at the back of the plane. The survivors, all of whom were seriously injured, were transported to different hospitals for treatment and were not immediately aware of the fatalities. Rosington, for instance, was not informed until days later by his mother in the hospital that Van Zant had been killed. Casey Gaines had been so fearful of flying in the Convair that she had preferred to travel in the band's cramped equipment truck instead, but Van Zant convinced her to board the plane on October 20th. Another member of the band's trio, backup singer Jojo Billingson, was not on the plane as she was under doctor's care in Sedona, Mississippi, dealing with health problems brought on by substance abuse. Billingson planned to rejoin the tour in Little Rock, Arkansas, October 23rd. She reported dreaming of a plane crash and begging guitarist and founding member Alan Collins by telephone not to continue using the conveyor. The band's ex-guitarist Ed King said later that he always knew it wasn't going to end well for the band due to their drinking and brawling, but he could never envision it ending the way it did. He recalls being overcome with sadness upon learning of the crash. So one of the interesting tidbits about this actual flight operation was this aircraft was potentially going to be chartered by Aerosmith before it was chartered by Lynyrd Skynyrd. This would have been for the Draw the Line tour. However, it was rejected because it was felt by the Aerosmith people that neither the plane nor the crew were up to standard. Aerosmith's assistant chief of flight operations, Zunk Bucher, told he observed pilots McCreary and Gray sharing a bottle of Jack Daniels while he and his father inspected the plane. Aerosmith's touring family were quite shaken after receiving word of the crash, as Steven Tyler and Joe Perry had pressured their management into renting this specific plane for use on tour. The doomed flight on October 20th, 1977 was intended to be the last Lynyrd Skynyrd would make on the Convair. In quotes, "We were flying in a plane that looked like it belonged to the Clampett family," said Pyle. The band had decided their status as one of the world's top rock acts wanted an upgrade. The band had planned to acquire a Learjet after arriving in Baton Rouge to replace the 30-year-old plane, which all the band's circle agreed was well past its prime. Rescuers had to cross a 20-foot-wide, waist-deep creek to dig through the overgrown forest while digging out rescue vehicles that got stuck in the mud. Locals worked with rescue officials and drove victims to the hospital in the back of pickup trucks. One local resident recalled, "I found someone on the ground alive. When I walked to the other side of the plane, I tripped on another person." Another resident commended the actions of all those who helped and highlighted that some of them were on the highway directing traffic. Some of them went to home and got tractors, while others got on CB radios and relayed messages miles away to rescuers. Even though, due to the reports from the Aerosmith people, toxicology reports from both pilots found no traces of alcohol or other drugs. The NTSB ruled the crew's inattention to fuel supply was ultimately determined to be responsible for the crash. The legacy of this accident, the record label MCA replaced the album cover of Street Survivors, as the original album showed the band surrounded by flames. The site of the crash became a memorial to fans, rescuers, and survivors. A oak tree has been carved with Lynyrd Skynyrd iconography, and the site was also the location for the 40th anniversary memorial by survivors and rescuers. There was a film created from this, Street Survivors, the true story of the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash. However, there was a dispute of a blood oath by survivors reportedly taken after the crash, never to use the name Lynyrd Skynyrd again in an effort to capitalize on the tragedy that had befallen them. The film premiered in February 18th of 2020. Now, the legacy of the crash, you look around online, did the crash change Lynyrd Skynyrd's trajectory as a band that would have been more popular if the members would have not passed away? Now, I was looking around online because even myself, I was kind of, okay, I've listened to Lynyrd Skynyrd songs. I don't know what came before and after. Obviously, we had an album coming out right when this accident happened that went platinum. Of course, there's different opinions on both sides. Yes, the band's been fine. It's huge. It survived. It would have been bigger. It would have been, more in the likes of some other large bands if this plane crash would have never happened. A lot of question marks there. I'm not a music aficionado. I'm not going to claim to be so. And I don't think any of us are Nostradamus, so it's hard to say what would have happened if this plane didn't crash. The group obviously did reform, with Van Zant's brother Johnny taking over as lead vocals, and they put out 9 studio albums since the crash and continue to this day to draw big crowds on the road. The Lynyrd Skynyrd that's on the road today does still sound a lot like the band that climbed on the plane on the fateful flight in 1977. But of course, much has changed. 20 musicians, not counting backup singers, have been in Lynyrd Skynyrd since the crash. Guitarist Gary Rosington is the only member left from the band's heyday. So if anybody's into guitars, they probably know of Stevie Ray Vaughan. Stevie Ray Vaughan was 35 years old when he passed away. His career only spanned 7 years. He's best known as the guitarist and frontman to the blues rock trio Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble. Now, we all know Stevie Ray Vaughan played guitar until his fingers bled. There were certain times in his life he played the opening act for Huey Lewis and the News. I know from reading past articles that he was frustrated at the time. Obviously, Huey Lewis, Stevie Ray Vaughan, probably not the same mix of music goers that may appreciate either one of them. But if you're there for a Huey Lewis concert, you may not necessarily appreciate what Stevie Ray Vaughan was doing. Although his mainstream career spanned only 7 years, he is regarded as one of the most influential musicians in the history of blues music and one of the greatest guitarists of all time. In the early morning of August 27, 1990, Stevie Ray Vaughan was killed in a helicopter crash in East Troy, Wisconsin. Vaughan had spent 5 days performing his band Double Trouble at the opening for Eric Clapton at the Alpine Valley Music Theater, 30 miles southwest of Milwaukee. After the concert concluded, Vaughan and 3 members of Clapton's entourage boarded the helicopter that crashed into the side of a nearby ski hill shortly after takeoff. The Civil Air Patrol was notified of the crash at 4:30 a.m., and authorities were called to locate the scene of the accident. All 5 people were pronounced dead on arrival. The autopsy concluded that Vaughan suffered multiple internal injuries and died of exhaustion, bleeding to death, due to a blunt trauma in his chest and abdomen. The coroner had found no evidence of drug or alcohol use and recorded death by misadventure. The day before the crash, Stevie Ray Vaughan allegedly told his band and crew members about a nightmare he had had in which his own funeral and saw thousands of mourners. He felt terrified yet almost peaceful. Backstage after the show that evening, the musicians talked about playing together again, particularly with Eric Clapton for a series of dates at London's Royal Albert Hall in early 1991 as a tribute to Jimi Hendrix. Moments later, Clapton's tour manager Peter Jackson said the weather was getting worse and they would have to leave soon. Vaughan's last words to drummer Chris Layton were, "I love you." 4 helicopters were waiting on a golf course to transport the group members to Chicago. Vaughan was with his brother Jimmy Vaughan and Jimmy's wife Connie as they went to board their reserved Bell 206B jet range helicopter piloted by Jeff Brown. Jackson had told Vaughan that the seats were reserved for all 3 of them. However, they discovered that the seats had been taken by Clapton's agent Bobby Brooks, bodyguard Nigel Brown, and assistant tour manager Colin Smith, with only 1 empty seat available. Vaughn asked Jimmy and Connie if he could take the last seat, saying, "I really need to get back." Jimmy and Connie obliged and caught the next flight in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin with manager Mark Prock. Vaughn and the other 3 passengers departed aboard the 3rd helicopter in dense fog at 1 a.m. Brown piloted the helicopter off the golf course at a high speed and slightly lower altitude than the others. It banked sharply to the left and crashed in the side of a 300-foot ski slope about 0.6 miles from the takeoff location. No fire or explosion occurred. The bodies and debris were scattered over 200 feet. No one was aware that the helicopter had crashed until it failed to arrive at its final destination. As noted, the Wisconsin Civil Air Patrol found the wreckage at 7 a.m., 50 feet below the summit of the hill. Shortly after, Clapton and Jimmy Vaughn were called to the morgue to identify the bodies. According to the autopsy report, Vaughn had suffered many unsurvivable injuries, such as a transection and dissection of the aorta and multiple depressed skull fractures, along with a ruptured spleen and liver and fractures to the right thigh bone and ribs. Brown, the pilot, had many hours of flight experience in the Bell 206B, even at night, but he was only instrument rated on airplanes, not helicopters. In fact, not long before the flight, he had failed his instrument check ride. According to the NTSB, the cause of the accident was determined to be controlled flight into terrain, as Brown could not see the hill due to low visibility. Vaughn's death triggered an outpouring of grief around the world. The album Family Style, the only collaboration recorded with his brother Jimmy, was released in September 1990 and became Vaughn's best-selling non-double trouble album. On August 31st, Vaughn was buried at Laurel Land Memorial Park in Dallas. Funeral services were held with over 1,500 people in attendance and 3,000 more outside the chapel. Omniflight, the company that owned and operated the helicopter, was sued for negligence by Martha and Jimmy Vaughn. They claimed the pilot, Jeff Brown, operated the helicopter recklessly under visual flight rules while in instrument meteorological conditions. The lawsuit ended in a settlement. The widows of Vaughn's bodyguard, Nigel Brown, and assistant tour manager, Colin Smith, received more than $2 million in settlements. To this day, there's an annual motorcycle ride and concert in Dallas to benefit Stevie Ray Vaughan's Memorial and Scholarship Fund. The city of Austin, Texas also erected a Stevie Ray Vaughan Memorial statue at the auditorium shores of Lady Bird Lake, the site of a number of conferences with Stevie Ray Vaughan. To this day, it has become one of the city's most popular tourist attractions. The city of St. Louis also hosts the annual Stevie Ray Vaughan tribute concert around Thanksgiving featuring local musicians. In 2000, Vaughan was introduced to the Blues Hall of Fame. So back to the beginning of this episode and what spurred this idea to talk about musicians and tragic incidents in the course of musical history was the passing of Jimmy Buffett, a loved artist and famed aviator. And I had heard of this incident actually when I was out of Margaritaville in Orlando, and I'll get into a little bit of the aircraft itself, but if you've heard the song Jamaica Mistake-a, it's all about this incident that Jimmy Buffett had while he was in Jamaica and was mistaken as a drug runner. So we'll get a little bit into the details of that. On January 16th, 1996, Jimmy Buffett's Grumman HU-16 Albatross, which I think arguably is the most famous aircraft that people know for Jimmy Buffett and his aviation career, was dubbed the Hemisphere Dancer. It was shot by Jamaican authorities as he taxied in the waters near Negril. The Jamaicans had mistaken it for a drug runner's plane. Though Jimmy had only come for chicken, on board the plane was Chris Blackwell from Island Records and U2's Bono and his family. Bono described the incident in a Belfast Telegraph. "These boys were shooting all over the place. I felt as if we were in the middle of the James Bond movie, only it was real. It was absolutely terrifying and honestly thought we were going to die. Thank God we were all safe and sound. My only concern was for their safety. It was very scary, let me tell you. You can't believe the relief I felt when I saw the kids were okay." When Jimmy had landed the plane in Negril, near a spot where Buffett wanted to introduce his friends to his favorite jerk chicken, the confused police opened fire as the passengers began to disembark, believing them to be drug smugglers. Bono and his family had to dive for safety to avoid being hit by bullets, which cracked the windshield of the plane and punched holes in the fuselage. Buffett later estimated at least 7 shots were fired, but nobody aboard the plane was injured. Bono was upset by the incident. He and his family left Jamaica immediately afterward, while Buffett stayed behind to settle things with the police. He later seized the incident in a song titled Jamaica Mistake-a, and he was philosophical about speaking to the Spokane fan review the following year. Buffett had said, "Like all things, it made for a good song. I know there are times in my life where I probably should have been shot for a lot worse behavior, but in this particular instance, I was innocent. Not even a spliff. Nobody was hurt, so I said, let's just get on with it," he added. "Some people said, God, you could have sued them. You could have sued the government. But I went, no, it's probably karma. We're even now." Says, "I talked about when I was in Orlando, the Albatross. Where is it now?" We'll talk a little bit about the aircraft and if you're in the Orlando area where you can go see it. So the 1954 Grumman HU-16 Albatross, dubbed the Hemisphere Dancer, was primarily used by the Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard in the early years as an amphibious flying boat. In 2003, Jimmy retired the Hemisphere Dancer and put it on display at the Lone Palm Airport outside of his Margaritaville Cafe in Orlando, Florida. It sits there to this day, and visitors can walk right up to the Albatross at Universal Studios City Walk attraction. After Buffett had donated his Albatross, he still had a Cessna 208 Caravan with amphibious floats. And in 2009, he also bought a 1939 Grumman Widgeon seaplane. I also wanted to add in, for anybody that hasn't seen, there is a petition going around, which I'll add into the notes section, that people want to rename the Key West International Airport Jimmy Buffett Airport. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of naming airports after people, because I feel like a lot of people don't know, John Wayne or Muhammad Ali, but I personally would be open for maybe Key West International Airport Jimmy Buffett Terminal or something like that. At least my 2 cents. But like I said, nothing against Jimmy Buffett, nothing against any of them. I just, I feel like when you name an airport after a person, sometimes the idea of an airport gets lost then of where people actually think they're going. Even to this day, airport codes, right? People, when I first was working with some of the airlines, they would see ORD and say, "Oh, I'm not going to Orlando." So like I said, but I will drop that in there if you have support for that idea, so you can take a look at it and decide for yourself. So my friends, this is a longer episode than we normally have, but I hope that you enjoyed some of the stories we had today. Obviously, this may just be the first of several because there are so many stories, artists, unfortunately, that have had incidents in aircraft, some that haven't perished. Obviously, if there's Kardashian fans out there, I personally have never watched the show, but I've been to Blink-182 concerts. I like Blink-182. I know, as some of you may or may not know, Travis Barker was in an accident that he survived. So there's a lot of stories out there that we can talk about on this subject. If there's parrot heads out there, I share in your mourning. I appreciate the music and the memories that we have of those times and of all these artists. So like I said, we have some stickers that we're developing for this podcast. We're putting some things together. We've been tweaking with the website. You can always go to www.destination-aviation.com to check us out. You can also get in touch with me with dapodcast85@gmail.com. Feel free to drop me a line, notes. If you have constructive criticism, feel free. This is not my day job. I am not a podcaster, so I will always take any recommendations anybody has. I wanted to say thank you for listening and tuning in. We are back to our regularly scheduled weekly episodes. And like I said, this trip that I was just on, I got some ideas of things I want to do. Drop me a line, stay in contact. And until next time, I will see you down the runway.